so much for being awake right now. I know it's quite late for some of you. And yes, the defense should be in August, so thankfully a little more time than spring. I will share my slides now, and we can go ahead and get started. Okay. Are those good for people? Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. So today I'll be presenting, as Megan said, We Are What We Eat, Alice Waters' Slow Food and Moral Agency. This is one of the chapters of my dissertation, or a version of one of the chapters of my dissertation. So trying to engage with some kind of more popular food writing and bring that in conversation with more analytic philosophy. So the plan for today is to go through some background of just like food and philosophy, then talk about food and morality, food and culture, maybe if slow food is the solution or not to some of our cultural problems, and then finally give kind of a proposal of ways we might conceive of the idea we are what we eat in ways that avoid some of the potentially problematic ways. Okay. Sorry, it's being weird. Okay. So for context, because I know not all of you are philosophy folks, or many of you are not philosophy folks, this is just a very brief sketch of what a philosopher might do. So some of what we do is clarify things like what the question is. If we're thinking about we are what we eat, what is the question that's being asked there? And the question is like, are we what we eat? Waters is answering in the affirmative. What the underlying kind of commitments are for even asking the question, what the structure of the argument is. So what is she actually saying about the idea that we are what we eat? And then we critique. So this is why philosophers aren't always like the best party guests or friends. So we raise objections to these arguments. We provide counterexamples to existing analyses. And sometimes, not always, we propose something that might be a synthesis or a new analysis of the question. One way to think of this might be like improv, you're doing yes and, philosophy's less friendly and doing yes, but like you can never just agree with something, you always have something more to say. Like I said, not always the most popular position to take. If you're Socrates, you end up dying because you've corrupted the youth and you're sentenced to death for asking too many questions. So kind of sums up philosophers. Philosopher of food, a more recent thing going on. So in contemporary philosophy, the focus has often been on animal ethics. So whether or not we should eat meat, whether that's morally justified, whether factory farming is morally justified. And that's still part of the conversation. But in more recent years, attention has turned to broader questions such as the metaphysics of food, the aesthetics of food, the political philosophy of food, etc. Culinary Mind organizes a lot of these talks, and philosophers of food are giving these talks at interdisciplinary conferences, such as the Association for the Study of Food and Society, and trying to bridge kind of the philosophy and food studies gap. But in some ways, this isn't new at all. It's a return to like much earlier philosophical questions. So philosophers in ancient and early modern times were extremely interested in the role diet played in self-constitution. So even though it's kind of a new turn in analytic philosophy currently, it's not at all new in philosophy to be concerned with the ways that diet shapes ourselves. Okay. Most of you probably know who Alice Waters is, but a quick background. So she founded Chez Panisse in 1971. So it's a Berkeley, California restaurant, pioneering the farm-to-table movement in California cuisine. She's the founder of the Edible Schoolyard program and School Lunch Initiative in Berkeley, which is kind of partnered with Chez Panisse. Been vice president of Slow Food International since 2002. This will be relevant later in the talk because I think she has a different portrayal, at least in this book, of slow food and its values than Slow Food International portrays. And I think some of where we might go awry in the book might be solved by Slow Food International. She was named Best Chef in America in 1992 and received the National Humanities Medal in 2014 for celebrating the bond between the ethical and the edible. As a chef, author, and advocate, Ms. Waters champions a holistic approach to eating and health and celebrates integrating gardening, cooking, and education, sparking inspiration in a new generation. So Alice Waters is an icon in the food movement, especially kind of farm to table, slow food. She does really great work. I don't want this talk to be construed as somehow an attack on her in general. The only reason a philosopher engages with anything is because they think there's really valuable material there to pull out. But like I said, it always ends up being yes, but. So I think she gets a lot right here, but also some ways we should be cautious. So in her book, We Are What We Eat, a Slow Food Manifesto, she makes some claims. I want to preface, because she prefaces the book by saying that she is not making kind of careful academic arguments. It's not an academic book. It's not locked down with footnotes and things like that. But I'm not picking at any of the points that are like footnote type points. I'm not criticizing small, tiny points. I think she really is giving a strong moral argument, and it should be addressed as a strong moral argument. So the premise of the book is that the world is increasingly dominated by fast food culture, which is industrially produced, standardized, convenience maximizing foodways. And this isn't merely quick service chains. This is anything that's not kind of a whole ingredient, not a scratch ingredient. And she thinks that because everyone eats, food offers a uniquely universal and accessible domain for reshaping the self, and through the self, the world. That's a claim that I'm very sympathetic to. I think many of the people in this room are sympathetic to. And then she argues that embracing slow food practices such as cooking from scratch, eating seasonally, and eating intentionally with others can help us to reconnect with both community and nature. Again, something I'm very sympathetic to. This book is kind of written for people like me. I eat very local, very slow food ways, but not entirely. I might be categorized as a fast food person in many ways by Waters, which highlights some of the limitations of the view. Okay, so she divides the world into fast food culture and slow food culture. And I think we can agree that fast food is taking over in many ways. So she lists the fast food values as convenience, uniformity, availability, trust in advertising, cheapness, more is better, and speed. So she intends these, I think, to be intuitively not great values. And I think for those of us who already share the slow food values, this is going to be true. We're used to there not being convenience and uniformity and availability. One sec, the cat's gonna go up. Okay. Nice. So slow food values: beauty, biodiversity, seasonality, stewardship, pleasure in work, simplicity, interconnectedness. These are really great values, and these are, not surprisingly, the ones she thinks we should embrace and practice. But it's also true that some of the things in fast food values are helpful for lots of people. Cheap food, while problematic in many ways, many people are financially limited. Uniformity, it is difficult to have to make different choices constantly. Not everyone can give up convenience of everything, but she has a very sharp dichotomy in the way that she presents these cultures and these food values in her book. So she argues that if you're eating in a fast food restaurant or in a fast food way, not only are you malnourishing yourself, but you're also unwittingly digesting the values of this fast food culture. So those values are becoming a part of you, just like the food. And once those values are a part of you, they change you. You begin to have a different outlook on things, different cravings, different moral standards and expectations. You begin to accept these values as truths, that our choices, food related and otherwise, have no consequences. So this is what she means with the claim, we are what we eat. We're not just physically what we eat, it makes us the kind of moral person that we are. And if we eat in fast food ways, we end up being a fast food person and a less kind of morally robust or agential person. So she has kind of three key commitments that go on in the paper or the book. So one is about food and morality. So she argues that eating practices are tightly linked to moral agency and identity. She has a claim about food and culture, that fast food culture underwrites our major social and political ills. And then she has a claim about slow food as the solution. So how slow food culture provides us a solution to the major social and political ills that are part of the second commitment. I'll go through each of these in turn. I think with each of these, she gets something importantly right and also something importantly wrong. So again, that kind of yes, but thing I talked about at the beginning of the talk. So I'm going to talk first about the food and morality claim. So there are two separate questions if we think about food and morality. One question would just be, are food choices moral choices? And then another question is, if they are moral choices, what kind of moral choices are they? So there are a few ways that food choices might be treated as moral choices. And none of these will be surprising. I think these are very common in the domain of the world. So environmental responsibility, people might feel like they should eat in a way that's responsible for the environment. Animal welfare, this is why people are vegetarians or vegans or eat just ethically produced food from various ways. Health and self-care, there's often a lot of morality. And this is something that like Megan Dean, who introduced me, does work on around like the obligation to be healthy and moral. And we do view it that way. There's lots of evidence that people view people who seem less healthy as being like morally worse because they're eating badly or something like that. There's questions of justice and labor ethics. So are the people producing your food being treated in fair ways? Community and localism, cultural authenticity and heritage, moderation and virtue. So similar to the health and self-care, a lot of ways that we view people who are like eating either too much or too little, but usually too much as like lacking in some sort of moral restraint and not being kind of as good of people. Purity and naturalness. This is one that comes up a lot with things like GMOs and also organic food, but just the idea of contamination. And I think that's very common right now in things like the Make America Healthy Again movement and worries about like food dyes and various like toxins in our food and things like that. And it is viewed as not just a health issue, but like if you're a good person, you should be eating this way and feeding your children this way. So Waters has two types of people on the morality side of things. So she has fast food people. And fast food people treat food primarily as a quick commodity, so they prioritize the values she talked about earlier, the speed, efficiency, little attention to origins, seasons, or ecological and social relationships. And it's not just that this is how they eat. She's arguing that this orientation reflects a broader moral character, shaped by detachment from nature, diminished sensory awareness, and a preference for convenience over care. And this is in contrast with slow food people, who treat food as a moral practice, approaching eating and cooking with care for beauty, biodiversity, seasonality, stewardship, and community. And again, this isn't just the way people eat. This orientation reflects a broader moral character, marked by attentiveness, ecological responsibility, and generosity towards others and the natural world. This dichotomy, even though she thinks that you can shift between them with changing your practices, seems really problematic, especially since with her very expansive view of what fast food is, anything other than like cooking from scratch completely, almost all of us are fast food people, even foodies. And it seems maybe not great to say that we all are just having like lacking in moral character. So we get this response from Paul Thompson, not directly to Waters. He's a philosopher of food, kind of a pioneering philosopher of food and agriculture. And he argues that we're not what we eat for those very kind of concerning reasons. So he argues that the ethical significance of food lies primarily in production systems, markets, and institutions, not in personal diets. So eating itself is largely prudential, aesthetic, or cultural, rather than a test of moral character. So for example, he talks about meat consumption, and it's not that we should be criticizing whether individuals eat meat or don't eat meat, but we should be criticizing regulations about how meat can be produced, factory farming, things like that. And that's where that like moral status comes in, is where we think about the systems level. Individuals eat and they're subject to lots of constraints, so they just eat. But it seems like that might be missing something, because we did talk about earlier how there are lots and lots of different domains that food might be ethical. So we get this response from Lisa Heltke, another really influential food philosopher, and she argues that, and this is directly in response to Thompson, that eating can't be separated from the broader chain of food practices. So food practices are relational, they're embedded in networks of people, environments, institutions. And she's making this argument that eating can still have ethical significance, though we want to be careful to avoid becoming moralizing or purity focused in the ways that some conversations about food and morality can be. So we get this kind of tripartite framework. Don't worry, this is definitely the densest philosophical section of the talk. We'll get like into less dense things very soon. But we get Waters's view. And I don't think this is just her view. I think this is a very popular view. It's a manifesto, but people do think food choices reflect moral character often. She specifically thinks that it's slow food people and they cultivate virtues through fruit and fast food people cultivate vices, and there's this focus on how individuals eat. Whereas Thompson, ethics lies in institutions and markets, personal diet is mostly prudential or cultural, and then the focus is on how food is produced and sold. And then Healthkey, maybe somewhere in the middle, ethics lies in our relationships and practices, eating is embedded, and the focus is on how eating connects us to others, which I think helps us move into the way that I think is a productive way to think about food and morality, which is this kind of two ways that food might be moral. Um, so food practices might be a form of moral evaluation. And if we're morally evaluating, we're saying people are morally responsible for the food choices they make. If it is true that we ought not to be eating meat because of animal cruelty, then people are kind of individually being bad people or morally responsible if they choose to eat meat. Waters embraces this, not specifically about meat. She absolutely loves meat, but about any particular food morality you adopt. She embraces this in the half of the book on fast food, so people are morally responsible for this. Thompson condemns this, and Healthkey doesn't completely condemn this, but is very cautious about this. We want to avoid that kind of virtue signaling. And then we have food practices as moral agency. So this is the other way that I think we can talk about food being moral. And here people are expressing their moral values through their food choices. So Waters embraces this in the half of the book on slow food. So she talks about how, we express our values through this. Thompson doesn't say much about this, which is, I think, why Heldke has a rebuttal to him in some sense. And Heldke embraces this. Like, it's important, our relations around food and our food practices. So we might think that if food is moral, we should think about it more as moral agency and less as moral evaluation. And we might be able to avoid some of the problematic condemnation and purity culture that comes around with a lot of morality. And as we'll see with some later slides, Waters is pretty harsh about the moral evaluation of people who eat in slow food ways. So I think we have really strong reason to focus on moral agency rather than moral evaluation, and that probably transfers not just outside of conversations around slow food practices, but around food practices in general. So yeah, I think this is the part of Waters' proposal that we should hold on to, because food really does play an incredibly important role in the way that some people, at least, form their moral identities and relationships with the world. But we can also endorse this without thinking that people who don't form their agency in this way are less moral or something like that. There are many ways people might form their moral agency, and many ways which people who are forming their moral agency through food practices might be missing out on because they're not participating in other practices. So really wanting to hold on to basically the second half of her book about the ways that slow food can enhance life and agency, maybe less so the part on fast food people and the ways that they are morally suspect. Okay, so moving to her second claim, that food underwrites kind of our cultural ills, we can have two questions here. Are food practices foundational for culture? And does it follow from that that our cultural vices are all rooted in our food practices? And again, this is going to be a question where I think she gets the first part right and not the second part. So food is the foundation of culture. I mean, a lot of you are food studies folks. I don't think this will be surprising to anyone. It may not be the only foundation of culture, but it's very formative for culture. So we have material ecological foundations. So food systems shape the material conditions of life. So how land is used, how labor is organized, and how economies function. We get social relational foundations, so practices of preparing and sharing food, establishing bonds of kinship, hospitality, and community, while also making boundaries. So who eats together, who serves, who is excluded. And this would include important things like feasts and the way that elders transfer cultural generation through food practices and feasts and things like that. And then we also get the symbolic foundations, where food can represent cultural heritage, religious commitments, or visions of the good life. So dietary rules, celebratory foods, and movements such as ethical or real food show how food practices encode judgments about purity, virtue, authenticity, responsibility. Much of life is undergirded by food, and everybody eats every day, or at least hopefully everybody is eating every day, hopefully multiple times a day. Food is essential for life. Everybody partakes in it. That's a main reason that food people think that it's very foundational, because you can't avoid food. But I don't think it follows that that means food practices are the foundation of vice in the ways that Waters seems to think. Um, she thinks that convenience leads to passivity and ignorance in all areas of our lives. So, again, convenience about food leads to passivity and ignorance in all areas of our lives, and letting others think for you. Uniformity about food leads to racial and other kinds of profiling because we forget to treat people as individuals. Um, Having food available all year, so the global food supply chain leads to a globally homogenous culture and causes us to lose our sense of cultural identity, taking ourselves out of time and place. Trust in advertising about food causes us to lose our relationship with the truth, leads to fake news, and breaks down the cultural foundations of objectivity and truth. Uh, Cheap food causes us to stop caring about how long things will last, how well they are made, and whether the things we purchase have been made with integrity. And being able to access food quickly and not putting the same time and energy into preparing our food causes us to stop caring about values such as pleasure and beauty and feeds our sense of loneliness. And I'm not saying that Waters is completely wrong, that these things might be related and that our food practices influence other ways that we live our lives. However, it does seem like a strong claim to say that wanting, for example, your apples to be the same generally, or something like that, grocery store food is more uniform than small market food, leads to racial profiling. Um, Perhaps that's the case. Maybe that's an empirical claim. But it seems like a very strong claim to say that food practices are the foundation of these kinds of cultural vices. And part of the reason it seems implausible is that vice predates fast food. Um, Poverty, exploitation, alienation, these have shaped human history for centuries before the birth of McDonald's. And McDonald's was kind of what started the slow food movement. Um, so I don't think fast food culture creates entirely new problems. It just amplifies existing tendencies. So habits of acceleration, standardization, the devaluation of labor, which are already woven through contemporary social life. It may be one of the most visible sites for these dynamics play out, but I don't think it's their only source. And that's a major difference from how Waters is viewing things. The way Waters is portraying things, at least in this book, it does make it seem as if food is the thing that makes us act in the ways we do, whereas it seems more like our food ways currently might be more of a symptom. We have cheapness and standardization in lots of areas of life, not just our food systems. Okay, so food and culture. I think food does underlie culture in a really significant way. I don't think food underlies all of our cultural vices, even though it might be a very visible site of them. Okay. So thinking about slow food as the solution, which is what Waters argues for, we have two separate questions. One would be, can adopting slow food practices and philosophies save the world from the cultural vices that Waters describes? And another would just be, can adopting slow food practices and philosophies be beneficial to individuals and or communities? One of those obviously has a much higher bar than the other. So if we think about saving the world, if Waters is right, that food culture is the foundation of all our cultural virtues and vices, it's easy to see how changing our food culture would transform these cultural vices, which is what she argues for in the book. But if we accept the conclusion that I argued for in the previous section, that food culture is not the foundation of all our cultural virtues and vices, then it's hard to see how changing our food culture would transform all of these cultural vices. So why would eating in a slow food way transition to all of the other things? And there are some practical limitations with saying that we should all kind of switch to eating in a slow food way. Alice Waters lives a very privileged lifestyle in many ways, not just in financial ways, but where she lives and things like that. And not all of us can live in those environments. Not all of us can live in Berkeley, California. And scaling these things, so enacting the ideals of the slow food movement at a kind of really grand scale would require effectively restructuring our entire economy and our land use patterns. And it seems very unlikely that people want to go back to 40% of people working in agriculture. people like that we have centralized agriculture. And I don't think it's all bad in the ways that Waters seems to portray. Um, we would not be able to live in cities, basically. There's very interesting research on what it would take to actually scale up slow food at a kind of global level for everyone. And it just isn't the world we live in now. So maybe it would be a great world, but it's not a world that seems like it makes sense to put pressure on individuals to bring about in their eating practices. But perhaps that's besides the point, because Waters, she talks about the power of embracing slow food to affect the world, but the manifesto is primarily focused on the individual, so slow food people and fast food people. So maybe the fact that slow food can't scale up in this way doesn't really matter because we still have access to the versions of slow food that we already have. But even though she says things in the book, which again seem quite strong, like she never does anything out of convenience, if that's true, that she really never does anything out of convenience, that puts her in a very privileged category of people in the world. People do have time constraints, they do have geographical constraints, and they do have financial constraints. It takes a lot longer to eat in a slow food way. It takes a lot longer to get your groceries in a slow food way. It takes a lot longer to cook your groceries in a slow food way. And then you have a lot more dishes if you're eating in a slow food way. And that just is a time constraint. And it's, I think, great and valuable if people want to put that time into food. But saying that it's kind of, we all have the time, we're just not allocating it in the right ways, is probably a stretch, at least for many people. And then there's geographical constraints. As Megan mentioned when she was introducing me, I'm finishing up in grad school, so I'm applying to lots of jobs. One of the things that I'm looking for when I'm applying to jobs, since I'm applying all over the place, is whether there's local food, like whether there's local produce, because many places don't have local produce. And it's very unclear how one is supposed to eat in a slow food way if someone lives in a place that doesn't have kind of local farmers markets or local farms. I'm lucky to have that here, but that's because I live in a particular place that has that. And then there are lots of financial constraints. Slow food is more expensive. It's true that you can get certain deals at the farmers market at certain times of year, but generally farmers market food is going to be more expensive than the grocery store. Generally, food cultivated on small farms by people really dedicated to their craft is going to be more expensive for good reason. But it just is, and not everybody has that excess income. And again, Waters seems to portray this in a way that would be, we have the money, we're just not allocating it correctly. But I think that's a stretch. And as someone who, again, I have sort of time, the geographical constraints are great for me. The only reason I personally, as a graduate student who loves slow food, can afford to eat in a very, very slow food way is because I work at the farmer's market and I can get discounts on food and I have friends with farms. I don't think it's an accessible thing in the way that she seems to say it is. So we have practical limitations beyond the scaling up. We have our individual practical limitations about whether we can access slow food. And then she doesn't bring this up. And again, she loves cooking, so for her, this wouldn't be an issue. But there's serious gendered labor limitations when we think about scaling up slow food. So globally, women do most of the cooking. And if we all return to cooking everything from scratch, that actually doesn't mean that we're all returning to cooking from scratch. It means that women will be back in the kitchen, not men. So we see this a lot. There's been recent examples. So the Make America Healthy Again movement, the emphasis is on moms. There was an interesting, I think, New York Times article about kind of a Make America Healthy Again, like commune type place in Ohio. And all of the men are still working high-powered positions and making money to people to live in their million-dollar houses, but women are strongly encouraged to be the stay-at-home moms who are cooking everything for their kids, probably homeschooling their kids. And that cuts across political divides, but there's still this strong gender divide in this movement. And there's increased pressure on women to be homemakers, partly in order to feed their families real food. And that was, again, kind of the moralizing purity things that I was talking about early in the talk. And not all women should need to spend all their free time in the kitchen. I love spending time in the kitchen, but even I don't want to cook from scratch every single night. I know that my mother also really loves to cook from scratch, but has had times where she's like, I'm spending all of my time, like hours a day, cooking in the kitchen. And even though I love it, is this where I want to be spending all of my time? And Alice Waters might want to be spending all of her time in the kitchen, but it seems like not everyone should have to. You should enjoy it and you should love it. And not everyone does, and that's okay. And again, we don't want movements that put all of the labor burdens on women, and slow food movements largely do. Okay, but I do think we can get goods. So even though we want to be careful about thinking that slow food can fix everything, I think her positive values that she articulates are really valuable. Eating in a slow food way can deepen your awareness and inspire a sense of awe and joy. Um, Having value of biodiversity, you promote acceptance, cooperation, and integration. You realize that everything has its place. It's always kind of sad to learn when like a bug or something you don't like is actually really important for agriculture. But you know, you accept it and you move on. And the beauty, uh, food is much more beautiful when you've been waiting for it all year. You have awe and joy when the first strawberries come to market, if you're in a place that strawberries aren't growing most of the year. And you see them as more beautiful than you might otherwise. And that relates to the seasonality. So, seasonality teaches us patience and discernment. It helps us to determine where we are in time and space and how we can live in harmony with nature. This is a thing that I very much took on when I started eating in a more slow food way. It's winter right now. It's a very patient time. I'm mostly eating mushrooms and potatoes, and greens that are cultivated indoors. And I'm having to be very patient, but I know I'll be very excited once rhubarb comes in April, once morels come up. And it helps me, it does root me in time and space. I have a good friend, can't tell you exactly their birthday. I know it's in early June because it's at the overlap of strawberry and asparagus season, because that's what I've served them for their birthday before. So it does teach you this kind of patience and embracing that seasons are happening. And it might cause stewardship. So changing our attitudes and intentions, causing us to become environmentalists who work together with nature. But even that might be a little bit of a stretch, just because even slow food farming isn't necessarily, it's not the same thing as being an environmentalist. Farming is always with a slight tension, even with the most wild farming. So we might increase the ability to want to take care of the earth, but not necessarily. And if you're just going to the farmer's market in a large city and getting your produce and cooking in a slow food way, I'm not sure that that connects you to nature much more. But I think we can get these goods from slow food. It's not that slow food does not enhance our personal agency, and it's not that it can enhance our community agency. It's just that it's not going to solve all the problems in the way that I think Waters is portraying. This comes up very kind of concisely in the way that Anthony Bourdain talked about Alice Waters. This was an online or like interview back and forth conflict a while back. So he says that Alice Waters annoys the living shit out of me. We're all in the middle of a recession. Like, we're all going to start buying expensive organic food and running to the green market. There's something very Khmer Rouge about Alice Waters that has become unrealistic. I'm suspicious of orthodoxy, the kind of orthodoxy when it comes to what you put in your mouth. And here, I think Bourdain is pushing very much back on this kind of moral evaluation or condemnation component of things, where you don't want orthodoxy about what you need to put in your mouth and to think that you're behaving wrongly in some sense if you're not putting the right things in your mouth. And yeah, so a lot of the reasons we might want to, but then he also had a follow-up afterwards because he received a lot of criticism for criticizing Waters. And he says, in a perfect candy-colored world, I'd like to eat most of what she'd like to see us eat. I feed my daughter mostly organic food whenever possible. True, I'm suspicious of wealthy suburbanites who preach back to the soil philosophies, as if most or even many could start digging their own subsistence gardens in their backyards or afford expensive organic or locavore lifestyles. But Chez Panisse was inarguably a cradle of the food revolution. I respect Alice Waters' enormous contribution to changing the way we eat and cook today. So this highlights that tension between, on the one hand, we don't live in a perfect candy-colored world, and it doesn't make sense to blame people for not eating as if they do live in a perfect candy colored world. But he's also showing that he understands and embraces the value of things like organic food and slow food. Um, we just don't want to make it morally required, but still really embrace the positive values that we can get from it. Okay, so I've gone through kind of Waters's three key claims. So food and morality, that they're tightly connected, um, but I've pushed back on how tightly connected and the ways that we're subject to moral evaluation. Food and culture, again, I think she gets something really right about the way that food does underlie a lot of our culture and cultural practices. But again, pushing back on that because I don't think that food is the source of all of our cultural vices. I think food is just a symptom of larger cultural vices. And then slow food is the solution. I pushed back on that by saying, I do think slow food is great and can give us lots of good things, but there's lots of practical limitations, both at the individual level and the community and global level for scaling up, to thinking that slow food could be the solution to our larger global problems that we have. So I'm now going to turn to the last section of the talk. I'm not giving like a tight, this is exactly what we should think slow food is, or this is exactly how we are what we eat. But I'm going to kind of give some ideas about ways we might think about it, which I've been pointing to throughout the talk, which I think can help us retain the valuable parts of Waters' philosophy without maybe the more problematic aspects. Okay, so revisiting slow food, and this is something I mentioned when I first introduced Alice Waters at the beginning of the talk. So Slow Food International, which is based in Italy, and which Waters is very involved in. She's written the introduction to like the slow food book. But it has an emphasis not on the everyday eater, but on the agricoloso or the foodie. So the problem is people who are espousing the values of, say, great bread or something, but not thinking about where the grains are coming from or who's baking it or things like that. So it's not on the person just trying to make it through the day, but people who are identifying their agency and values with food already and not connecting it back to the earth and the producers and the other moral things that come with it. They also have an emphasis on the systems of food production. And that's similar to Thompson's argument, right? So we should focus on the major players that are shaping our food world. If we want to get rid of the cultural vices around food, it's not individuals who are going to do it. It would need to be different regulations or different practices, different community structures, systems. And I think that if we pivot a little bit back from Waters towards this Slow Food International, this allows us to avoid a lot of the individual moral condemnation that Waters puts on like fast food people, as she calls them. So I think that this is a very valuable way to revisit things without having to turn away from slow food at all, in many ways. Just turning away from some of the things, which is a very American sense of slow food in a way, focusing on the individual and our practices. Okay. So beyond the fact that we can get slow food without kind of the stuff that Waters brings in with slow food, I also think it's important to remember that there are other ways that food practices shape our identity beyond just slow food. So even if you think food is the kind of major agential thing in life, which I think a lot of, I mean, food philosophers think a lot about food and we care a lot about food, so do food studies folks. But other food practices can also be formative in identity and moral agency. So we might have things like vegetarianism or veganism, which doesn't have to be just about like the animal itself, but the way that you're expressing that you care about something. So Megan Dean, again, who introduced me at the beginning of the talk, has a really excellent paper called You Are How You Eat, Femininity, Normalization, and Veganism as an Ethical Practice of Freedom. And she's not arguing that people should or should not be vegan or vegetarian because of the animal ethics reasons. It's saying that we should embrace the ways which people who are choosing to be vegan or vegetarian are choosing to enact their moral agency and enact their freedom. Religious food practices, similarly, they don't need to be local food or slow food, but they can still be really important. So this could be things like eating halal or eating kosher. This could also just be things like having certain foods at certain holidays. Um, and that might not be slow food, but it's still traditional in some very important sense that connects to culture. And again, cultural foodways, you might even think about things like, this is a very silly American example, but I tend to be someone who makes an exception for like if I go to someone's house for Thanksgiving, I don't eat much meat. And if I do, it's not usually industrial meat. But you know, if I go to someone's house for Thanksgiving, it seems really valuable for me to eat like the turkey there or something like that. And that seems like a formative way that we have identity is sharing food with each other. And all of these are compatible, and that's not the only ways. There's many other ways food practices can be formative, but they're also compatible with slow food, but they don't require slow food. And they can be just as significant with relationships to others, a sense of self, and even more conscientious relationships to nature than eating in a slow food way. You might be a vegetarian, an ethical vegetarian who eats, you know, mostly processed vegetarian food, but you still might have a much more conscientious relationship to like living animals and things like that. Um, Another thing I want to talk about is just that I think there are non-food ways to get the slow goods. So we've talked a lot about the positive food values, and I think they are really positive values. But it's not clear that you need slow food to get them. So we might have nature attentive outdoor practices, so things like bird watching, plant identification walks. These cultivate beauty, seasonality, and attentiveness to place in a way that probably shopping at your farmer's market in Los Angeles doesn't. Um, we might have seasonal sports, embodied outdoor rhythms. So I'm thinking about things like cross-country skiing, sailing, surfing. These require a lot of awareness of seasonality and patience. If you're a surfer, you know when the tides are. If you're a cross-country skier, you're looking at the snow conditions and the weather. And these are dependent things. You have to be patient. You can't always go cross-country skiing. You can't always go surfing. Sometimes the snow's not there. Sometimes the waves aren't there. Um, Environmental stewardship practices. This is another one where things like habitat restoration or invasive plant removal, watershed cleanups, these seem like things that cultivate stewardship and ecological responsibility much more than eating in a slow food way, to be honest. I don't know that me eating, you know, non-native things that are cultivated nearby that are really tasty from local farmers is actually stewarding environmental practices. Um, we might think about craft traditions, so things like woodworking, textile crafts. These cultivate beauty, patience, care, and everyday practices. They're very slow crafts, slow traditions, um, community rituals that aren't centered on food, right? If we think that community is one of the valuable things we get out of food, we want to remember food's not the only way we get community. So things like volunteer work, religious celebrations, neighborhood festivals, and these cultivate community, generosity, shared meaning. And this is also the kind of thing I was gesturing at where I said that if we get our value and meaning and moral agency from slow food practices, we might be missing out on some other things. For example, I'm not particularly religious, so I'm missing out on the community formation that I would get from religious celebrations. I'm missing out on the kind of yearly rhythm of various religious celebrations. Um, and I don't want to be condemned for that personally, but I'd like to think that we can enact our agency through different modalities. And then we also have contemplative practices. So things like meditation retreats, nature-based spirituality, and these also cultivate awareness, patience, appreciation of fleeting moments. Um, you know, doing deep meditation, regardless of how you eat, is going to cultivate those kinds of things. So again, the point of this slide is just to think about the ways that the slow goods are great, that Waters articulates, and slow food is one way we can get those slow goods, but not the only way. Okay, so just kind of summarizing what the key takeaways have been, because I know I've talked about a lot, some of it super philosophically dense, not all of it, hopefully. So Waters brings attention to something important. So our food practices do play a huge role in shaping who we are, including our moral identity. But we should emphasize how food practices, including slow food, but not only, can enhance moral agency, and we should back off from moral evaluation of individual food practices. Food practices are foundational for many aspects of culture, but they're not the root cause of all of society's ills. Eating in a slow food way can enhance individual and cultural moral agency, but it isn't the panacea Waters characterizes it to be. It won't solve everything. And slow food cultural values are important, but food practices aren't the only way to access those slow values. So foodies should remember that other practices are also morally formative, and just because this is where we, probably many people in this audience, get a lot of our value, doesn't mean that that's the only place that you can get value in life. So these are things that I'd like you to take away from the talk. And thank you very much for coming. I look forward to everyone's questions. The slides are available on the Culinary Mind website for the event. If you have if you want to look back at them during Q&A or anything like that, We're Excited are also available on those slides, but I don't think we need to go through those here. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Emma. Wonderful.